Okay. So this is our introduction, our crash course on some of the aquatic invasive species that are problematic on Long Island and some of the ones that the LIISMA team and our partners work with. So we'll help with some of the ID. So folks can, it would be very helpful for others to keep a lookout for these species as they're near waterways, boating or kayaking or whatever. All right, let's get started. What is an invasive species? Just in case you haven't heard, these are non-native species that cause harm to the environment, the economy, or human health. And when we're talking about aquatic invasive species, these are species that spread through waterways, through several pathways, including boats and equipment, ballast water, aquarium releases, live bait, waterways, spreading more or less on their own, especially during floods and other high water events. And some are imported as live species for food. Aquatic invasive species outcompete with our native fish and other species. They cause loss of habitat and local biodiversity. They can damage equipment, clog waterways, and generally decrease the resilience of our ecosystems. We have more than 120 aquatic invaders on Long Island, unfortunately. So we spend a lot of time prioritizing and carefully selecting what we can work on, which will give us the greatest impact and will be feasible to work on to control. Aquatic invasive plants form dense mats that can be difficult to navigate in, and they act in a sense as ecosystem engineers, depleting oxygen and contributing to rapid eutrophication. Dense floating mats of leaves block sunlight to submerge native vegetation. LIISMA works with partners to manage AIS, including water chestnut and Ludwigia peploides. We'll talk more about Ludwigia in a moment. Aquatic invasive plants create barriers to fish passage. This is a photo from Ligony Brook in Southampton at Long Pond Greenbelt. And within a relatively few short years after it was controlled manually once, the Phragmites has grown back. And on the left, you can see the little stream path there, the brook. And on the right, that's what it looks like about 2 years ago. It's very difficult for fish to pass through that, including the alewife and American eels. So we're working with partners out there to come up with a solution to this. All right, let's look at some invasive plants, aquatic invasive plants, and how to identify them. I'll just point out first, great field guides for aquatic invasive plants. Through the Looking Glass on the left is my favorite and a lot of people's favorites. Great for identifying aquatic plants. And on the right, also good, New Jersey Aquatic Plants. Two great field guides. And then I'll turn it over to Abby.
Hi, thanks, Bill. Yeah, the New Jersey Aquatic Plants Guide is brand new and I have it. It's great, especially interesting for Long Island because New Jersey has a lot of pine barrens ecosystems as well. So there's some good overlap in our aquatic species. So to dive into the water, there are basically four different groups we could group aquatic plants into. Submerged plants, ones that have leaves mostly underwater, and maybe some flower stalks that stick above the water. An example of that is Carolina fanwort, we'll talk about later. There's also free-floating plants like duckweed. I'm sure you've seen that scattered along some water in the past. And those are ones that are not attached to the bottom by roots or rhizomes. There's also floating leaf plants, which are rooted with leaves at the surface, and they can be in intermediate depths. They might have leaf structures, different leaf structures for their underwater leaves and the leaves that float at the surface. An example of that are pondweeds. And there's also emergent vegetation whose leaves extend above the water surface, usually can be found in shallow water. An example of that are cattails. Also pictured in that picture is purple loosestrife and Phragmites. And now I'll pass it off to Cassidy to get us started on identifying some of these aquatic invasive plants.
Thanks. Yeah, so our first category is those floating leaf plants that Abby mentioned. And our first floating leaf plant is water chestnut, Traponatans. You may have seen this before, and you have in our previous slides. This is a widespread aquatic invasive species growing in fresh water as a rooted floating plant, and it's annual. All its plant structures die back in the fall, and the population regenerates from its nutlets, which germinate in the spring. Its leaves are arranged in rosettes with triangular, serrated individual leaves. And the nutlets shown in the top right are the seed pods, which are dark blackish brown in color with sharp terminal barbs. Water chestnut also has inconspicuous white flowers at the center of the rosettes and bulbous air bladders for buoyancy on their petioles. It impacts aquatic ecosystems by forming dense mats that shade out other plants and cause competition for nutrients and space. Since it is widespread or a tier 4 species, it's managed for specific habitat protection purposes rather than with the goal of eradication. Fortunately, it can be managed effectively by pulling and disposing of the rosettes before they set seed in midsummer, with repeated treatments over years to deplete the seed bank. Next is yellow floating heart, Nymphoides peltata. This is a freshwater aquatic perennial invasive species with cordate or heart-shaped leaves and a backward-facing rounded lobe. Its leaves are 2 to 5 inches long, and it has showy yellow flowers with distinct, jagged, sharp edges on the petals. Its leaves are tangled stems, forming a thick mat, which makes it difficult to remove. Like most invasive floating leaf plants, it shades native plants growing below and outcompetes natives for resources. This can also spread by fragmentation. Now for some native and invasive lookalikes. Native white water lily, Nymphea odorata, is recognizable by their showy white flowers and large circular waxy leaves. It appears similar to invasive frogbit and invasive yellow floating heart, especially without its flowers, but its pads are much larger, growing up to 8 inches, while the invasive's leaves are 5 inches at most. The lobe on white water lily is also much sharper as opposed to the rounded cordate leaves of those two invasives. Invasive frogbit also looks very similar to invasive yellow floating heart with its small heart-shaped leaves, but can be distinguished mostly by its 3-petaled white flowers as opposed to the showy 5-petaled yellow flowers on floating heart. And floating heart also has purple undersides of the leaves, while frogbit does not. Another native lookalike is water shield Brasenia shrubbery. It's a perennial aquatic species, but can be distinguished by its oval leaves, which grow 4 to 5 inches and lack a split in the leaves. It also has long branching stems and small red flowers. Next, we have spatterdock, another native lookalike. This is an emergent, floating aquatic plant with its leaves held several inches above the water or floating on the water. The leaves are typically 6 to 12 inches long with a cordate or ovate shape and smooth margins or leaf edges. The leaves are sharply cleft and divided into 2 basal lobes where its petiole joins the blade. Spatterdock flowers are deep yellow and bowl-shaped up to 3 inches wide, and what appears to be its petals are actually sepals, of which there are usually 6, and close to the center, there are many smaller petals surrounding the reproductive structures of the flower. Water lettuce, Pistia stratoides, is another aquatic invasive, with floating leaves forming a rosette and have feathery roots extending up to 32 inches below the surface, but they do not anchor in the soil. Its leaves are thick and ridged, a dull light green in color, and have short velvety hairs on the leaves. Its leaves are basal, meaning they don't have stems, and this does make it resemble a head of lettuce. They can grow as a single plant or reproduce vegetatively via stolons. It can reproduce by seed as well, making control more difficult. And water lettuce is typically introduced via water gardens or aquarium dumping and may also be spread by boats and trailers. Now I'll hand it off to Melody to get into some more plants.
Thanks, Cass. So now we're going to be moving forward with submerged leaf aquatic ID. First, we have Myriophyllum spicatum, a highly invasive milfoil species that is deceptively delicate and fragile in appearance. It forms thick mats in shallow areas of a lake, quickly growing and spreading to block sunlight and killing off native aquatic plants that fish and other underwater species rely on for food and shelter. The plant is submerged and rooted in sediment with long branching stems and feather-like whorled leaves. Typically, there can be around 3 to 6 leaves per whorl, um, and 10 to 24 leaflets per long feathery leaf. One thing that's helpful in IDing them is how long the stems can grow, topping out anywhere from 3 to 10 and even so much as 30 feet long. It has small reddish flowers that are held above the water on a spike. Next, we have the hybrid water milfoil, which is another invasive milfoil species that tends to hybridize from invasive and native varieties. The only sure way to properly ID them is through genetic testing. However, some helpful ID characteristics in getting closer to understanding them are that we typically see less leaflets per leaf, usually somewhere around 5 to 14, but it can vary. It isn't uncommon to see red stems or red rings around the stem at the cross section of the leaf. Also, the red stems tend to be much thinner than the native variety. The species also reproduces from fragments and seeds and may be more tolerant of herbicide than other invasive milfoils. Next, we have the variable leaf milfoil, another invasive milfoil species that is very hardy and can establish itself in a multitude of aquatic habitats and climates. The species overwinters in frozen lakes and northern climates and can thrive in warm southern water bodies as well. It can tolerate a wide range of water quality conditions and prefers slow-moving waters, particularly lakes and ponds, but occasionally can be found in rivers as well. Species has 2 different leaf types, 4 to 6 leathery whorled leaves per node towards the base, and broadleaf whorled leaves near the branch tips that rest above the water. The stems are often very robust and red. So next we have the native lookalike of this species, which is northern water milfoil. The main difference between them is a much stouter stem that can also be red at times and less leaves and leaflets overall. The northern water milfoil has around 4 to 5 pairs of leaves per whorl and less than 14 leaflet pairs. It is often mistaken for coontail or invasive water milfoil, but it does not branch at the surface as much as invasive water milfoil does. Northern leaves are rigid when removed from the water, but invasive milfoil leaves are limp when out of the water. The northern species also forms winter buds or groups of small, dark, brittle leaves in late fall and winter, but the invasive variety does not. Okay, here is a side-by-side comparison of all the different milfoil varieties mentioned. With the invasive variety on the left, as you can see, it has a much more feathery appearance and up to 24 or more pairs of elongated leaflets. And the leaflets are blunt and end almost all at the exact same point. Another good point to notice is that the terminal leaders or branch tips tend to be a reddish brown as seen here. Next to that, we have the hybrid variety, where red stems and leaves can be common or reddish markings on the stems. Leaflet pairs tend to typically be less than 14 with a slightly more uniform appearance. Then next to it, we have the variable leaf milfoil. That's very thick and almost gives a coontail appearance, but doesn't hold that shape out of water. It has 2 types of leaves, one that is feathery with leaflet pairs under 14, and the other is a whorled broadleaf, present at the branch tips. Last, we have the native water milfoil with a significantly less dense appearance. Leaf pairs are under 14, red stems, and a distinctly ridged, crisscrossing coontail shape. Holds its shape out of water, isn't forked like that of the actual coontail species. Next, we have hydrilla, another whorled and submerged rooted aquatic invasive species. The leaves are broad and not feathery, serrated, and usually come in whorls of 5, but occasionally can be more, up to 8. The plant is noticeably rough to the touch, with spines on the leaf midribs and turions present. Tiny white flowers present themselves on long stalks above the water. And by this point, there's probably an infestation present, as this is a species that otherwise goes unnoticed, with tubers spreading quietly in the substrate at the bottom of a lake or pond. It is considered one of the most problematic invasive aquatic plants in the United States. Next, we have the invasive waterweed, which is a submerged aquatic similar to hydrilla and native elodea with very dark green foliage in whorls of 3 or more. Typically, we see them in whorls of 4 most often. The leaves are abruptly narrowed to a pointed tip with very fine teeth that require a hand lens to see, but are not directly visible and serrated the way that hydrilla's is. It has white flowers that protrude just above the water surface with 3 petals and 9 to 12 golden stamens. The stems are buoyant and known to form dense mats on the surface of the water. These mats crowd out native aquatic species, provide poor habitat for fish, and impede boat movement and other recreational activities. Here we have the native Elodea canadensis species, whose leaves typically occur in whorls of no more than 3 and appear to be smooth-edged. Look for leaf clusters compacted near the tip and spaced farther apart down the stem. Stems are brittle, branched, and form a large mass near the lake bottom. White flowers have 3 to 4 petals and bloom during the summer, and flowers are attached to the stem by a thread-like stalk. So here is a side-by-side comparison of the 3. Native Elodea is in the middle. It has whorls of 3 with no serrations present. Agaria or invasive water wheel typically has whorls of 4 with minute serrations at times, and hydrilla has whorls of 5 with visible spines on the leaf veins. And lastly, we have the native lookalike for all of these species, which is coontail. Coontail is particularly different from those mentioned before this because it always holds its shape out of water. It's very rigid, and its many leaves form X cross sections around the stem, and they are particularly forked or toothed into a Y shape. And that's all for me from now. So take it away, Abby, with some more submerged aquatics.
Thank you. Thanks, Melody. So moving on with some plants that have more of a feathery-like appearance, we'll start with Carolina fanwort. So again, this is a fully submerged aquatic invasive species, except it has occasional floating leaves and emergent white flowers as pictured. The leaves have a feathery fan-like appearance that is attached to a petiole, so there's another short stem attaching to that main stem. Now, this species is native to the southern United States, but as it's expanding its range, it does have invasive characteristics up north here. And it spreads very easily by plant fragments. One of those plants, you try to pull it and it breaks into pieces. So that is one of the ways that it could propagate and take advantage of high nutrient conditions in some of our water bodies. A native lookalike to this species are bladderworts or utricularia species. And on bladderworts, the leaves are finely divided in a branching pattern along the main stem of the plant. Rather than looking like a feather in the way that Carolina fanwort does, this kind of looks more like filaments that are attached to the main stem. A distinctive thing about bladderworts is that you see these little structures that are called bladders. And in some species of bladderwort, it's more obvious than in others. Those bladders are used to capture and digest small aquatic organisms. These are carnivorous aquatic plants. Again, native plants. And they create forage opportunities for fish, too. The flowers emerge above the surface and can be very cute. This is a little yellow one, but in different species, you can see different colored and shaped flowers. And again, trying to identify a bladderwort, look for the bladders. Next is parrot's feather. This is an aquatic invasive species with stout, long stems that are suspended in the water column or can be floating. Sometimes can even be seen protruding on the shoreline. So it's a very adaptable kind of species. And yes, so some of the leaves also look like feathers, as you can see here. That has a denser arrangement at the top. That's distinctive of it. And the flowers occur along the stem. Parrot's feather. Here's another side-by-side of what those leaflets can look like on parrot's feather versus the other milfoils that Melody mentioned. So you can see these are longer and have, I guess, a moderate amount of leaflet pairs compared to your Asian water milfoil. But looking at the overall structure of the plant can be helpful here. So these can look very similar, but again, looking at the structure of the plant, seeing that crowded, dense arrangement of leaves at the top is very distinctive of this. And also it's kind of like a bluish green color that is distinctive. Next we have starry stonewort. Now this is a species that has not yet been detected on Long Island, so keep your eyes out and let us know if you see it. This is an invasive species with white star-shaped bulbils, and that's a reproductive part. It makes a clone of the parent plant, and it can be found at the base of the plant. These have smooth branchlets and have bracts that stem off of it. What's distinctive about here is that it's uneven forked appearance. You can see this one's longer than this one, and that's distinctive of starry stonewort. The branches also go limp when squeezed. So this is the thing you'll hear again and again about these aquatic plants. If they hold their shape out of the water, this is one that doesn't and can just become like a little pile of mush in your hand. But still something to look out for and can have kind of that invasive behavior. So native lookalikes to starry stonewort are some of our native macroalgal species of Cara and Nitella. So Cara or Cara is a type of algae, and it has a crusty feel from the calcium carbonate that is in its cells. It gives it a rigid feeling. It has little branches that are in whorls, and you can see along here there are not really barbs, I'd say like bumps, ridges that just give it kind of this rough texture. It has a skunky smell, and it does not have those star-shaped bulbils as the last starry stonewort did. There's also this one, Nitella, which can look similar. We have native varieties, and this is another algae that's whorled. This one is smooth compared to the bumpy Cara and not smelly. Both of these can be in rather deep water, like up to 10 meters. And this comparing this one to the starry stonewort of the previous slide, this Nitella does not have that uneven branching pattern that starry stonewort does. So there's more even, symmetrical, maybe you could say, branching at the whorls. Finishing off with some pondweeds. So we have 36 different species of pondweed in New York, and only one of them is invasive, so this is an easy one for you to remember. We have many native pondweeds that serve an important role for food for waterfowl and habitat for fish, also grounding the sediment. And something distinctive about all pondweeds is that they have a midrib. Even if the leaf is like very, very thin, there's still going to be a midrib on there. So a midrib is something that really divides that leaf, and if you look for it, it's very likely to be one of these pondweeds. So this curly leaf pondweed has a slightly flattened stem, and the most distinctive thing about it is this wavy leaf margin. It's so wavy, it looks like a crisp piece of bacon. It doesn't have floating leaves, so all of these leaves are going to be under the surface, but it does send a flower spike above the water in the spring. So this kind of flowery spike structure, that is similar across pondweed species too, so that's something distinctive, the midrib and that flower spike. But for curly leaf pondweed, our only invasive pondweed, look for these wavy leaf margins. Here are some other pondweeds you might encounter. Notice midrib. There's midribs on there and here, and this one is an herbarium specimen, but there is a midrib there. These might seem to have wavy margins, which is why I picked these, but they actually, it's not that like tight crispness that podweed and crispus has. And yeah, so I will pass it off to Bill to finish up our aquatic invasive species.
Thank you, Abby. Let's look at a free-floating plant. Frogspit. Frogspit is a floating aquatic plant native to Europe and Asia. It resembles a miniature water lily with small heart-shaped leaves and delicate white flowers. This plant forms dense mats on the surface, outcompeting native vegetation, reducing oxygen levels, hindering recreational activities, and impacting water quality. Native lookalikes, little bit. Duckweed is much smaller than frogspit, with tiny oval or rounded leaves. It doesn't have the distinct flower like frogspit does. Watermeal is even smaller than duckweed and is often considered the smallest flowering plant in the world. It appears as tiny grain-like particles floating on the water with no visible leaves or roots, and it lacks the structured appearance of either frogspit or duckweed. A couple of emergent plants. Watercress, fast-growing aquatic plant native to Europe and Asia. Small, rounded leaves and white flowers shaped like crosses, 4 petals. Watercress is often found in cool, flowing waters, like you found on Long Island. It can spread quickly, forming dense mats like the others that displace native aquatic plants, alter water flow, and reduce habitat quality, like most of the others do. Floating water primrose. This is a plant originally from South America. It has bright yellow flowers and sprawling stems that float on the surface of the water and take root in shallow areas. This plant can form dense mats, blocking sunlight, reducing oxygen levels, and crowding out native species. Its aggressive spread can degrade water quality, disrupt aquatic habitats, and interfere with recreational activities. Like some of these, or like all of the other aquatic invasives, early detection is important before it becomes established. And as we discussed earlier, LIISMA and the town of Brookhaven and DEC are controlling this at Artist Lake so it doesn't get into the Carmen's River. And the LIISMA team and partners also kayak the Carmen's River every year to try to find any new infestations. The Peconic River, if you want to see infestations, that's the place to go. And DEC is managing it there in the Peconic River. Some native lookalikes. Next slide. All right, we have native Ludwigias, and this is Ludwigia palustris. The invasive one, the Paploides, has a more aggressive growth habitat, forming dense, sprawling mats. And the leaves of the invasive Ludwigia are alternate. The invasive Ludwigia also produces very showy yellow flowers with 5 petals and is much larger and more conspicuous than the native. The native Ludwigia, the flowers are small, greenish, and less noticeable, sometimes lacking petals or having only a few petals. And the leaves of the native Ludwigia are opposite. We often find them in the exact same spots, same habitats they share. And we've been finding that once we pull out the invasive Ludwigia, this native one comes back in the same area, which is wonderful to see. That's it for our crash course.
There's one in the chat from Juliana. Does floating water primrose have 2 leaf shapes? Yeah, I would agree. I've seen that sometimes they tend to have these rounder leaves, especially in the stems that kind of try to reach out into the water body. I feel like those tend to have like a more floating leaf, a rounder leaf, and the ones that are growing more vertically tend to have smaller leaves, maybe a little bit more of a point to it. So dimorphic leaves, depending on where you are in the plant, but as Bill mentioned, that the alternate leaf branching is what makes it distinctive from other native Ludwigia species.
Yeah, thanks, Abby. And good question, Juliana.